The most fundamental biological need and reality amongst humanity is the union of the man and the woman. It's shocking to think that a religious institution could claim dominion over the most basic function of human nature. I myself experienced this in an Orthodox Jewish context as I was dating a girl who I was in love with. I had every intention of marrying this girl. It wasn't like I wanted to just hook up and mess around. Like, I actually was in love and wanted to do it right. But because I wasn't under their umbrella of authority and I wasn't following the laws that they set in place, they viewed me as a threat to their power structure, because they work in the business of arranged marriage, where if you want a match, you have to come to them, you have to speak to them, you have to ask them for their help in finding your mate. And the notion that a man and a woman can meet each other on their own terms is sacrilegious to them, because I was not involved in that process. The rabbi of this girl told her that I was anti-God and that she should swear on a Torah scroll that she would not talk to me. And this actually occurred. He took her to the Ark, where they keep the Torah scrolls, which is the holiest document, the revelation from God to the Jews. And he made her swear that she would not talk to me because of how sinful it is for a woman to love a man outside of the context that they allow. And of course, her parents were completely on board with this as well, following the rabbi's instructions, basically saying that there was no way that I could marry her because she needed to go study in seminary in Israel and spend years getting indoctrinated by the system as opposed to moving forward with her life. The institution is founded with quote-unquote good intentions. In other words, they're trying to protect something sacred, they're trying to protect something real, but there's a deep dishonesty in the claim that they're the ones who determine what is right and wrong. As a Jewish system rooted in Jewish law, the Bible is what determines right and wrong, because that is God's law. The uniqueness of Judaism, as opposed to other religions, is that it is not a man-made structure. It's God-made. It's imposed from above us, from an authority that's higher than any man. So for a man to take on himself to be the arbiter of truth and falsehood and be the guardian of holiness, while being the one to define that, he's now perverting the structure that God made. Well, I'll say one more thing, is that systems and institutions are necessary, but who determines what is right and wrong, and who builds the system? I would argue that the system built by God is the most effective system. And the minute that human beings start to meddle with the prescribed structure that God set, they're now finding themselves in conflict with God, and ultimately they're just enforcing their own power and their own ego at that point. Of course, it is not easy to navigate this life. And of course, there are complexities that are going to require deep thought and consideration. But to rob the individual of their God-given right to work through that process themselves in the claims that they're the ones who are fitting to do this, but you, little you, could never possibly achieve clarity, that in and of itself is extremely manipulative. Ultimately, the dialogue needs to be one of honesty and openness, where we can all talk about what we know and what we don't know, and then our doubts in between. But if it's a conversation that's relegated to the ivory tower of scholars, and you're never able to enter, and you're never able to have an opinion or an insight in that, well, then you're just existing in a cult that controls you. The idea is that God gives the individual the right and the ability to process his laws through their own capacities, through their own mind, through their own heart, and to access that in conversation, and to claim that the dialogue is limited to the elites. The Bible makes it very clear that there should be judges and there should be law enforcement, but whose judgment are they enforcing? Are they enforcing their own judgment? Are they enforcing their own laws? Are they enforcing their own ideas? Or do they exist solely as servants of God to carry out his commands and his decrees? And that's why it's our job to have an understanding of the Torah. There is a false idea that only the elites know the Torah, but God says you should know it, and you should teach it to your children, and you should be deeply aware of all the commandments so that you can observe them correctly. You need to read the Bible yourself so that you can know what the commandments are. And the idea of having leaders and teachers is necessary, but their job is to be transparent and to simply transmit what they know from God. And the minute that they have their own bias involved, their own ego, and they claim to be the pathway to God and that you can only access the truth through them, they're no longer a servant of God who's carrying out his will. They're now a servant of their own self as they try to advance their own agenda. When dealing with leaders, the way to differentiate between a true leader and a manipulative cult leader, con man, would be, what is their goal in dealing with people? Is their goal to actually help others and give them independence, or is their goal to keep all the power for themselves? Truth is very important, because if you possess the truth, then you can actually challenge the authority. If the authority is saying one thing and the truth contradicts what the authority is saying, you have now eliminated the validity of the authority, because they claim to be right on the basis of their title or on the basis of their claims. But if you can demonstrate clearly that they're wrong, all of the hypnosis surrounding their authority dissipates. I was telling this to someone recently, is because they were asking me, well, you're teaching differently than the Orthodox rabbis. Aren't you worried that you're wrong? And look, obviously doubt is a very real thing. But what I told them was, if I'm teaching the Torah, I'm either going to teach what the Torah says, or I'm going to teach what the rabbis say. And those are actually two different things. In many instances, if you're going to say something, what is the Torah's position on Anida, which is the menstruating woman who is impure during her period? According to the Torah, that is a 7-day period of impurity, and afterwards she's pure. But according to the rabbis, every single woman has the law of a zava, which is a woman who's having an irregular period, which means she has to count a full 7 days after she stops bleeding, and then she has to go immerse in a mikvah, all of which is not written in the Torah. So you can see how there's two entirely different responses depending on who you're representing. Are you representing God's revelation to Moses, or are you representing the thousands of years of endless circular conversations between rabbis and the Talmud? It is not the same thing. The response to spotting is that the Torah literally defines a zava as a woman who has blood flow for many days outside of her regular menstrual cycle, which eliminates spotting. Spotting is not blood flow, and it's not for many days. The whole point is that a woman having an irregular period is that she's literally having a period outside of her regular cycle. And that's the whole point. That's how you identify a zava. But there's no way in the world that every single month a woman is a zava. According to the rabbis, if you have sex with a virgin and she starts to bleed because you break her hymen, you have to worry that maybe she's a nida, right? Like, you know why she's bleeding. She's bleeding because you just broke her hymen, right? It's like you take a knife and like cut her vagina, like she's gonna start bleeding, right? So like, is she may be a nida? You know, like, no, she's bleeding for a reason. Same thing with spotting. Like, a spot is not nida. Nida is, the whole point is blood flow for multiple days. And if it does happen separate from the period, and it's a significant flow for multiple days, then that would be an irregular period, which then she would be a zava.
The Bible says specifically irregular flow, so
yes,
it's on the
yes. It says blood flow for multiple days outside of her cycle. Those are very specific qualifications to call a woman a zava. There's a denial of the actual language. Blood flow for multiple days. What about spots? That's not blood flow for multiple days. It needs to be acknowledged that God is not here to harm us. God's laws are meant to be livable. They're meant to give us richness in our life. They're meant to improve our state of existence and to give us clarity throughout our journey in this world. If you find that you are becoming neurotic due to these commandments, and you're now adding all sorts of fences and gates and additional guidelines, you find yourself going against what God says, which is, do not add or subtract to my commandments. This is God's expectation of us. For us to think that we know better than God about his own laws that he created is absurd. It's no coincidence that religions thrive off of people hurting themselves, which is called masochism. Masochism means you're hurting yourself and you're deriving some form of perverse pleasure because you think that you're pleasing this deity that you worship. But is that deity God? Are you actually worshiping God, or are you worshiping your own feeling of self-hatred? And this is very common with religious people who have OCD. They get compulsive about these rituals when God never demands any of that. God makes clear qualifications, clear requirements, and we just have to follow that and we'll find favor in his eyes. Pain and pleasure are very primal, fundamental, instinctual feelings that we have. Animals experience this as well. And they're not bad predictors. At the end of the day, if you're experiencing pleasure, that's That's a positive thing. Desire is an even more sophisticated thing because you're in touch with your innate need and want for something good in this life. God himself says that this life is good. The Garden of Eden means pleasure. It means pleasant enjoyment. God plants all the trees. He says, eat from all the trees. Enjoy his creation. The whole point is, you are here to experience the goodness of this life and to put in the necessary work that's required to maintain it. So long as you follow the guidelines that God sets for you, you are able to experience all forms of goodness. God gives us his commandments for our own good so that we can orient our lives in a direction that's positive for us. There are things that feel good that are not actually good. And that's a very important distinction that people need to make when contemplating their existence and how to behave. Often people do things that make them feel good because it's momentary pleasure, but it's well known that there's a lack of foresight in that, and that even though it feels good in the moment, it's actually harmful and destructive to your body and your soul and your mind. So we need to be cognizant of what is good and bad for us, not based off of our own judgment, but based off of God's judgment. And through a higher perspective that we only have access to because God reveals it to us, we can go ahead and live positive and productive lives. Take even the concept of celibacy amongst priests and nuns, the idea that Orthodox institutions separate men and women. They make a point out of the segregation of the sexes and the demonization of lust and sexual desire, which is perfectly in line with our nature and God's will for us. If you have lustful feelings for your betrothed wife, you're in a very good place. It's all about the context and where you're directing your feelings. If you're existing in the correct state of being with a holy relationship that's built towards the union of the male and the female and the creation of life and building a family with children, there is no problem with experiencing pleasure and lust and all of the goodness that comes along with the male-female relationship. And so to demonize sex and to elevate celibacy as being some high moral virtue is anti-life and goes against what God created. Sexuality is a very strong drive. It is our drive to procreate. And in a very fundamental sense, it is our feeling of individuality. The fact that we experience our bodies in such a powerful way and the union with the opposite sex and the creation of children through that. If an institution or a religion or an ideology can grab hold of your most powerful drive and they tell you when to have sex and they tell you who you can have sex with and they tell you how things should be, well, they control you. And again, it's not to say that there is no guidelines for holy and proper sex, but the one who provides those guidelines is God. And so if you read the Bible, you will see the guidelines that God presents, who you can sleep with, who you can't sleep with, what is considered moral, what is considered immoral. The Torah doesn't leave a lot of room for gray area with regards to sex and men and women. It's clear that the purpose of the male-female union is procreation. It is the realization of the masculine and the feminine combined, building offspring and allowing for the continuation of the species. It's promiscuity, prostitution, all forms of casual sex are very frowned upon in the Bible and outright prohibited amongst Israel. As it says, there shall not be a promiscuous man or a promiscuous woman amongst the children of Israel. And that's because it creates perversion. There's no fruits, there's no long-lasting commitments, there's no development of the soul in these interactions. It's extremely sinful when people think that they can take an act such as sex and make it casual and make it monetary and make it driven by all sorts of superficial desires, as opposed to the true fundamental desires, which are love and connection and family, right? Like, it's not like these things are not desirable, right? It's like there's a hierarchy of desires. Orgasm is a desire. Intimacy is a deeper desire. And so if you can have all of your desires met within a framework of holiness and goodness, you're experiencing the ideal. And that's what we should be striving for. And that's the standard we should be holding ourselves accountable to. Engaging in activities while not thinking about the consequences are going to leave you in a place of superficiality and a lack of depth and a lack of accountability for what you're doing. The reality is that a man and a woman having sex is going to result in the most significant thing on earth, which is the creation of a new child. For people to eliminate the consequences, be it through contraceptives or all forms of birth control or not engaging fully in the act, these are just ways to alleviate the consequences and put up a wall of illusion that you're actually having a good time, you're actually having fun, you're actually doing something enjoyable. It may be enjoyable in the moment, but the reality is you're looking ahead at a black hole of nothingness, as opposed to engaging with the desire to build and the desire to create and the desire to form something significant in this life. That's a far better path to be on. I think it makes sense to reject religion. I myself rejected religion when it was misrepresented to me. The reality is you're born with enough limitations as a human being in your body, in your family, in your situation that you're born into. The idea that you would now need an additional authority telling you what to do in areas of your life that you may have never even considered acting one way or another, it's extremely invasive and annoying. And for the most part, I would say to be very skeptical when a religion or an ideology is trying to impose its laws upon you. The only way, and we can all acknowledge this, whether or not you believe that God revealed his word or not, if God revealed his word, God would be the only one worth following, because God is the creator and God is above you and he knows more than you'll ever know about everything. And so if you were to possess the actual word of God, that would be something worth following. In other words, you should be skeptical of religious people trying to cram down their ideologies on you. And not just religious people. Don't forget, the secular culture is extremely dogmatic. You need to buy into a whole set of principles that are extremely immoral and extremely ridiculous in order to be accepted amongst their circle. One of the arguments of secularism is that it's a free, fun-loving society where there is no higher deity that's enforcing his will upon you. And so long as you're acting nicely and kindly to your neighbor and you're not hurting anyone, then you're all in the right place. I think that there's something extremely short-sighted about that, because what religion provides are guidelines in areas that you wouldn't necessarily consider. If you're secular, you're making the argument that humanism and Enlightenment values is sufficient to have the world be in a good place. It's rooted in the assumption that human beings can and should define all matters of morality and truth and falsehood, which is extremely arrogant and denies the fact that we as human beings are wildly ignorant as to the nature of reality. And if we were left to our own devices in order to predict and define everything, we exist in confusion, as can be seen. Just being nice and kind and not hurting anyone overtly, that being the determining factor for what's right and wrong, is insufficient, because there are matters of the soul and there are matters that go deeper than just the external layer. Even if it looks like people are living well, even if it looks like people are treating each other kindly, is what they're doing good? Are the consequences of their actions going to completely destroy the fabric of their own humanity and the people surrounding them? There are deeper considerations that require a sensitivity that only God can introduce to the picture. When God is telling you, no, like, you actually have to be careful when it comes to adultery. A married woman is betrothed to her husband, and there are severe consequences for engaging in the perversion of sexuality and in the perversion of nature and in the perversion of the laws of justice and truth that God has set forward. You're now on a different playing field. And it's only right as human beings that we need to humble ourselves to what we don't know and to what we don't control, which is just about everything. And so the same problem that you have with the ultra-religious who say, worship the Pope, worship the prophet, worship the Messiah, worship the rabbi, worship the human being that places himself in the place of God. That is the same problem that exists with the secular. Worship science, worship Darwinism, worship the mind, worship philosophy, worship the human being. And it all comes back to the same thing, and that's going back to Eve's sin in the garden, which is mankind's sin is wanting to be like God. Human beings deifying themselves is the original sin of humanity, and it continues to this day. So we need to acknowledge how limited we are in being able to determine right and wrong, and being able to determine what's true and false, and humble ourselves to the judgment of God. And that doesn't mean to allow every religious idea to take hold of you. You have to be very discerning as to what is correct and what is incorrect. But when you access the Word of God, utterly and completely humble yourself to His judgment. People think that they can't interact with God. They think that God doesn't intervene. They think that God is not here. A remarkable fact to know about the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh, is that the root word of His name is Hoveh, which means present. This teaches us that God is present with us. And despite the fact that we may not have interacted with him in a direct conversation where we talk and he responds, that doesn't mean that that's impossible. And it also doesn't mean that we understand the full picture of what's going on. That's why the biblical stories are so inspiring, is because they talk about a time, and they talk about a place, and they talk about people that actually experience the divinity that we yearn for. We yearn for it so much that we're willing to deny the existence of God because we don't experience divinity and godliness on such an open and exposed basis. But if we can learn anything from our ancestors, and we can learn anything from the stories that are in the Bible that God gave us to derive inspiration from, there were people that spoke to God. There was a nation, the nation of Israel. God appeared to the entire nation and gave the 10 Commandments, which are the foundations of morality. This is possible. And if you read the Torah, God explains why we don't necessarily see him among us. We don't necessarily have the ability to interact with him directly. As he says, "For I will conceal my face on that day because of all of the sins of the people." We need to recognize that we are very distant from God as humanity, as a society, and as an individual. You can transcend that, as we find with Noah, being a man who lived in an extremely corrupted time, in a time when God destroyed the whole world. But because he, as a single individual, walked with God, he had the ability to interact directly with God and be the savior of the human race. It's not impossible. And people who really have a desire for God, and people who really have a desire to gain access to the divinity described in the Bible, they shouldn't reject it because they haven't experienced it in their own tiny frame of reality, in their own minuscule time in history, because reality is far bigger than us, and we're interacting with infinity. And if we manage to raise our being to a level where we were worthy, it would happen. And that's a promise from God. God makes promises that if we were to follow his decrees and his laws, then we'd live in abundance, and we'd live in peace, and we'd live with health and with wealth and with beauty and with love and with life. These are God's promises. That's not the world we see. Why? Is that because God is not real? Is that because God is not reliable? Or is it because we are at fault for distancing ourselves from our Creator and from continuously denying his laws and continuously rebelling against his judgment and worshiping other gods and worshiping idols? And also, I don't think it's clouded to say that we are at fault for this. Like, if you read the prophets and you read the Bible, God repeatedly says, like, look at the trajectory here. Like, I take you out of slavery and you worship other gods. I bring you into the promised land and you worship other gods. I put you in the Garden of Eden and you listen to the snake. It really comes down to that, right? Like, either you point the finger at God and you say, oh, God doesn't help me, God doesn't talk to me, or you say, follow the actual history as it is illustrated in the Bible, which is that the repeated downfall of humanity is due to their own evil and their own choices to be destructive and their own choices to disobey God, despite God being charitable and being kind and giving them the ability to be autonomous beings. We continuously choose evil. And that's something God even says after the flood. He says, I won't destroy the world again with a flood because the formation of man's heart is evil from his youth. We seem to tend towards the direction of evil. That only works to our own detriment. There's a verse in Isaiah that says, God created light and he formed darkness. He makes peace and he created evil. And I find that to be fascinating, because often people think about evil as being independent from God. Even in lots of religious theology, there's God and there's the devil on the other side, and they're like adversaries, and like evil's like a whole separate existence in and of itself. But the reality is that God is the supreme creator. The same way he creates good, he creates evil. The same way he creates dark, he creates light. And so to divorce God from the equation when you're dealing with evil is natural, or it would seem natural. When you're interacting with evil, it's like your way out from God. It's your way to avoid God. It's your way to run away from God. It's your way to become independent from this being that is so great that he actually overwhelms you. That's what it comes down to, is we don't seem to be able to be satisfied. I think it's a misconception about independence. The assumption that to be independent from God would give us more significance as human beings. But the reality is that one of the greatest men in history, Moses, who by far had the closest connection with God out of every other prophet from every other religion throughout all of time, a man who spoke directly to God over many years and wrote down the 5 books of Moses, which is the revelation that we have containing all of the laws. Moses is described as being the humblest among men and a servant of God. Because of how great his connection was to God, that only increased his humility and increased his identity as being a servant of God. Being a servant of God is the highest praise possible. It's the highest form of existence possible. But people have a bad relationship with that. Like, oh, I have to serve God. Oh, I have to humble myself to someone greater than me. And so in the attempt to avoid that, they go and rebel against God. God created us with the ability to sin. He created us with the ability to make the wrong choice. We may be tempted to do that for a number of reasons. Ultimately, I think it's because we view ourselves as being separate from God. If you view yourself as being separate from God, you now have to develop yourself in exclusion to God. But if you realize that you are a part of God, you're actually made in his image and you're beloved by him, then you're not separate. You're part of his picture. You developing yourself in connection with God is the true development. In other words, I'm just saying I think it's mistaken. It's like you're saying, like, why do people make that mistake? Because they believe that they can only develop themselves as an entity if they're separate from God. But no one could be separate from God. So as they try insistently to differentiate themselves from God, they're really just getting further and further away from their own humanity, and they're denying more and more of reality. Let's just analyze this from a purely fact-based perspective. You are a human being. You are a small flesh entity on a planet. There is just about everything in reality outside of that. For a person to claim that they are the center of reality, for a small little human being to claim that they are the arbiter of truth and falsehood, and they're able to determine everything independent of God, it's just factually incorrect. There's so much delusion there that it's not even worth engaging with. How do you believe that as this small, limited entity is sufficient without being connected to the source of all existence? You're clearly not the source. You're clearly a creation. And so why even pretend otherwise? I'm saying, like, it's just a factual thing. Like, it's not a concept, it's not a metaphor, it's not an experience, it's reality. You are this thing. You are a human being on earth. The experiential element of life is by far the most compelling, because we are beings that are experiencing this existence. And so if we can experience truth, then we'd be fully convinced of its truth. I'd say put it to the test. If God is real, if there is this being above you, if there is a greater truth that you can and should access and be subservient to God, put it to the test. And as you put it to the test, you'll begin to experience your own humanity as you engage with infinity, and you're now engaged with the divine. Just engage with your existence. Engage with your humanity. Feel what it's like to be yourself in the context of existence as you interact with eternity. And I do believe that things will fall into place and you'll begin to experience what it means to be yourself, because the concept of God is not separate from you. The existence of God is not something that you either believe or disbelieve. It's reality itself. So if it's reality itself, you experiencing reality is the equivalent of you interacting with God. And if you open yourself up to really experience the truth of God, then you will. It's only the resistance to God that allows you to not experience God. Even if you're in the Garden of Eden, even if you've just received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, even if you're living in the Promised Land, you can be talking to God and deny God. So you get rid of this bad instinct that you have, because it is the tendency, but it's evil. And God expects us to fight that, as he tells Cain when Cain is contemplating killing his brother out of envy. God tells Cain, surely you should improve yourself, because sin crouches at the door and its desire is towards you, yet you shall rule over it, which means we are given the ability and the command to rule over sin, even though it's temptation, even though it's difficult, even though it's our tendency. Let's realize what's expected of us and root out the evil. There's a commandment many times throughout the Bible, destroy evil from your midst. That's said in the context often of the death penalty, which people find to be very extreme, and it is very extreme. But there are certain things that are so terrible that they do require the death penalty. What is the reason for that? Well, because you need to erase evil from your midst. You need to get rid of that thing that pulls you away from God. You need to rule over it. You need to get to a place where it does not rule over you, but rather you rule over it. Once you're at that point, you can experience your life without the barriers between you and God. God created evil. He created the snake. He created Satan. He created the existence of sin and the dichotomy of good and evil that we need to struggle with. But the reality is, if we were to leave that struggle to God and we simply engaged with what he told us to do, we'd be living without all of that conflict. And that is envisioned in the Garden of Eden, where you have, on the one hand, you have the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and on the other hand, you have the tree of life. The alternative to your investigation of good and evil is life itself, and experiencing your life as you were made to be a creation of God and to follow his plan for you in this world. So yes, there is an inclination to go against God, and yes, there is a reality of sin in existence and evil that is there to push you off course. But remember, Satan means the opposition. There always has to be an opposition. There always has to be a give and take. And that's what it means for us to be autonomous beings. We're not simply programmed robots. We're given trust. This is something I think is beautiful, actually, that God trusts us so much that he gives us the ability to choose. He gives us the ability to be in a domain that's very godlike, to have agency and to have the ability to consciously choose our destiny and to consciously navigate this life, even to do something bad. We're given that ability because God trusts that we will do the right thing. Unfortunately, we don't always do the right thing. In fact, we often do the wrong thing. It doesn't change the conditions that God set up, giving us freedom to navigate the roads that he's set. If you're not subservient to God, well, then who do you have to listen to? You get to choose who you want to listen to. You get to choose how you want to live your life, fully and completely. Even if it means killing people, even if it means having all sorts of forbidden relationships or all sorts of bad things, you can do it. You can do it because there is no one who can tell you what to do. Again, remarkably enough, even within religion, people will be claiming to submit to God, yet it's not God they're submitting to. It's a set of principles that they use God's name in vain to say that he said to do these things. But it's really just their own laws that they've created, that they're now submitting to the laws they created. So it's very crafty. They create a set of laws, and then they say that God made those laws, and then they submit to the laws that they made in the name of God. They submit to the laws they made. It amounts to the same thing. So the corruption that you see can't be rooted out simply by having a religious identity. It needs to be the corruption within. It needs to be the part of you that is resisting submission to God himself. There's fear to submit to God. There's uncertainty when you submit to God, and you are now acknowledging you don't control your life and that you are at the mercy of the judgment of a being outside of yourself. It's frightening. Ego death is a common term for that.